The hardest ruling of my life changed everything for several families, and for me as well, forever. I am Renee Williams, a judge in New York, and believe me, this case seemed simple, but it ended up being a whirlwind I hadn't anticipated. I had to make a firm decision, without exception, but empathy made me hesitate. I wanted to find another way out. The law dictated one path, but the consequences were much deeper than I imagined. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The story begins with two families facing off in a dispute that, on paper, wasn't very complicated: a fight over the custody of a child. A classic, routine case. But that's where everything started to spiral out of control. The father, a hardworking man with a complicated past; the mother, devoted and extremely protective; and in the middle, the child who couldn't understand how his parents could be at war. In the courtroom, I had to apply the law without being swayed by emotion, something easier said than done. What no one knew was that this child had hidden secrets, buried emotions that would come to light at the most unexpected moment. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, every little word could tip the scales. And I had to judge, decide who really should have custody, without thinking about what might happen afterward. But sometimes, the law cannot predict the harm a decision causes to people. During the hearings, details began to emerge that didn't fit. The father showed a side nobody knew, more vulnerable and anguished than he appeared in public. The mother, for her part, had deep reasons for wanting to keep the child away from his father. I felt the pressure to be fair, but also the responsibility to protect the child's emotional integrity. It was a terrible clash between the dry letter of the law and the human reality behind the case. When the moment of the ruling came, I knew that whoever the decision favored, someone would end up hurt. But the law left no room for doubt. The ruling had to be firm and final. When I announced it, I felt something inside me break. The courtroom fell silent. The looks were filled with pain, confusion, and perhaps a little reproach. What happened afterward was something I never would have predicted. Several families changed their course, relationships broke, and the little boy was marked. The hardest part was carrying that decision outside the courtroom. Seeing those people in their daily lives, knowing that my ruling had marked a before and after for them. The empathy I felt clashed with the firmness I had to maintain. I learned the hard way that being a judge isn't just about applying the law, it's facing the deep consequences that every word and every decision have on human lives. That case taught me that there are no easy rulings, and behind each one is a story few know. If you ever wonder what is the hardest part about being a judge, now you know. It's not the law, it's the humanity at stake in every courtroom. And although I fulfilled my duty, the scars remain, for them and for me, reminding me that in justice, sometimes there are no winners. The room was silent, and all attention was focused on me. I had read and reread every report, every testimony, every statement, but no matter how clear the law seemed, I knew this was not just another case to be filed away. It was a human conflict, a tangle of emotions and destinies whose effects would be felt far beyond those wooden and marble walls. The case involved a custody dispute over two young siblings following the unexpected death of their parents. The legal battle arose between their uncles, who, though family, held opposing views on who should take care of the children. The evidence clearly indicated that one of the uncles lacked the necessary stability, yet the other had issues that could not be ignored. The decision I made would change the lives of those children, and possibly their uncles, forever. I will never forget the first time I looked into those little ones' eyes. Their big eyes, full of uncertainty, seemed to search me for an answer I could not yet give. In that moment, I understood that the law, as just as it was only a tool, but the emotions, wounds, and hopes were deeply intertwined with that justice. During the hearings, the tension grew palpably. The testimonies were a mix of true love and accumulated resentment, half-truths and uncomfortable silences that weighed in the air. On one occasion, one of the uncles broke down in tears, revealing his inability to hold a stable job, while the other showed a forced rigidity, seemingly unshakable, but with a look that betrayed deep frustration. Amid tears, Accusations and silences, I found myself caught in the challenge of discerning not only what the written law said, but what the justice of the heart demanded. There were moments when I felt empathy gave way slightly to the strict obligation of justice. I recall, for example, when one of my closest collaborators suggested considering an alternative arrangement, some unconventional solution to prevent the children from being caught in an emotional whirlwind. But I had to remember that my ruling, whatever it was based on a principle of impartiality that I had to uphold. As the sentencing date approached, I began to feel a kind of weight on my chest that I had never experienced so strongly before. It was not just the legal responsibility, but a constant question about how much a judicial decision can alter the essence of a life. Was I doing the right thing? Could that sentence represent a positive turning point, or would it become an irreversible wound? Finally, the day came. Sitting on the bench, my gaze fixed on the expectant faces before me, I felt time stand still. With a firm voice but a lump in my throat, I pronounced the sentence according to the law, granting custody to one of the uncles. It was a candid, legally sound decision, but it could not avoid leaving some people hurt. Some faces, especially the children's, reflected confusion, sadness, and fear of the impending change. What no one expected was how that ruling unexpectedly changed the lives of everyone involved. The uncle who was given custody began to show signs of emotional strain that no one had anticipated, fighting relentlessly to meet the expectations of a stable home. The children, in turn, adapted with difficulty, and at times it seemed as if they held me responsible for the separation imposed by the law. Years later, I received a letter, silent and loaded with words that were nothing but a muted cry. It was from one of those children, now a teenager, asking if I had ever thought about how much a sentence could hurt. The experience made me understand that for a judge, justice is not just an abstract concept or a set of rigid rules. It is a tool with tangible consequences that shape lives and emotions. Nothing can fully prepare you for that mix of professional pride and human vulnerability you feel when making a decision that changes the course of a family. In the weeks that followed, while the case continued through its stages and the repercussions spread, I learned to face the dichotomy of my profession. On one side, the intention to apply the law rigorously, and on the other, the urgent need to integrate empathy without losing objectivity. No one assured me it would be an easy path, but I now knew with certainty that every ruling can be a dividing line between the past and a new future. That uncertainty, that inner restlessness about whether I could have done something more, taken a different step, asked a different question, stayed with me for a long time. And although the law kept giving me certainty time and again that I acted correctly, the inner voices never stopped reminding me that justice is not always synonymous with comfort. In the end, I understood that the role I play is not that of someone who pronounces a verdict and walks away, but of someone who makes a decision with the full intention of respecting where the truth must lead, without losing sight of the human complexity behind it. That made me a different judge, less cold, more aware of the impact every word I speak and every sentence I sign carries. Today, years later, I still remember that case as a pivotal moment in my career. Not because it was the most spectacular, but because it taught me to see justice as something alive, imperfect, and deeply human, a responsibility that goes beyond paper and the courtroom. Justice, I thought then, must bravely embrace not only the law, but also the lives that change after its application. Sitting in my office, I sometimes close my eyes and let this experience overwhelm me completely, to remember that behind every file there are faces, stories, and hopes that cannot be forgotten. Being a judge means accepting that every sentence you issue is a crossroads in the fate of others, and carrying that weight is both a privilege and a constant challenge. Sometimes, in the silent echo of the night, when the city seems to fall asleep, I hear within me that unsettling whisper, a mix of calm and unease, reminding me that being a judge is much more than a robe and a gavel. It is humbly accepting that every decision, no matter how just it seems, can transform lives forever, sometimes in ways I could never have imagined. And that, I believe, is the hardest sentence to bear. Because deep down, when the law meets the soul of people, all that remains is to learn to live with the impact of every word you said aloud, knowing that, although you may change whatever you can, you cannot change what has already happened. After delivering the sentence, I believed the most difficult chapter was behind me, that the law had spoken, and now all that remained was to wait for the wounds to heal over time. But what happened afterward was a brutal reminder that justice, even when it follows clear rules, moves on much more fragile and complex ground. Gradually, the courtroom emptied, but the story of those children and their uncles seemed not to find an end, but a labyrinth that kept us all trapped in its center. The uncle who had won custody began attending my sessions with his lawyer to request extensions, explain incidents, and present what he called unforeseen circumstances. Those recurring visits to my office, although professional, became an unexpected emotional burden for me. At first, I tried to keep my distance, convinced that my role ended with the sentence, but I quickly realized that the law does not close the doors so quickly in these cases. The children, who should have been the main focus, remained at the epicenter of a conflict that extended beyond the courtroom. I clearly remember when, through social reports and psychologists in charge of follow-up, I began to receive worrying signs. The older boy, whom I had already seen in the courtroom during the hearing, was going through a stage of low self-esteem and isolation. His little sister, on the other hand, showed anxious behavior, as if trying to hold on to a world that was slowly falling apart around her. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing was understanding that, although the custodial uncle struggled to fulfill his responsibilities, his capacity seemed to diminish under the pressure and circumstances that at that moment appeared insurmountable. There were days during those months when I questioned whether the decision I made was truly the right one. Silently, I wondered if I could have listened more, explored every corner of their lives with a less cold eye. The dilemmas began to cloud my days. How much can one person, no matter how prepared, bear the weight of deciding the future of others? I felt that knot in my stomach grow until it became unbearable, and yet, my commitment to the law and the institution kept me firm. Then came an unexpected twist. Once, during one of those routine visits to court, a lawyer handed me documents that not only confirmed the emotional instability of the custodial uncle, but also revealed negligent behavior that until that moment had remained hidden behind a facade of apparent normality. That revelation opened a new stage in the process, forcing me to consider the possibility of modifying the decision to protect the children. I weighed all options, consulted multidisciplinary teams, and sought advice to better understand the implications. But as I progressed, I realized that changing the lives of those children again, taking away their little refuge, would be another blow to them, a new fracture in a story that still had not healed. It was then that I began to understand how deep and persistent the impact of a sentence like that can be. It is not just about applying a ruling and having everything end. The judgment can trigger dynamics that slowly tear apart the fibers of those at the center. I saw how the scales of justice, which seemed tilted toward a firm and clear decision, wavered when faced with the reality of every face and every human story behind the pages of a file. I also found myself confronting people who, despite all the evidence and the rigor of the law, felt that justice had failed them. The reproachful looks, the pain-filled letters, and the broken voices in subsequent hearings seemed like a silent judgment against me. They were not just headlines or statistics. They were real, vulnerable people who saw the law as either an enemy or an ally, depending on the chapter of their story at that moment. And there, in the midst of that uncomfortable reality, the deepest questions began. What does it really mean to do justice when the heart and the law seem like parallel paths that rarely intersect? How does one remain impartial without becoming insensitive? Where is the line between protecting the children and respecting the human beings who also suffer the consequences? Questions for which there was no sure formula, only the certainty that judicial vocation is a constant lesson in humility and humanity. Over time, the case took a direction that surprised me. The uncles, despite their differences, decided to sit down and negotiate a new form of shared care, something that not only respected the law, but also the vital need of the children to feel the protection of both sides of their family. It was a slow process, full of effort and, above all, mutual recognition of their own limitations and strengths. However, That agreement would not have been possible without the intervention of justice as a starting point that forced everyone to look beyond their resentments and find a minimum common denominator. That moment set a precedent in my career and in the way I now approach every case, not just as a procedure, but as a living story where every word, every gesture, every glance carried the weight of the world for someone. I understood that the judge must be, at the same time, a firm referee and a discreet companion, an agent of balance who knows when to apply the law and when to open a window toward understanding. In human complexity, there are no absolute truths, but multiple realities woven with threads that even the best laws cannot fully unravel. And it was in that experience, in that mixture of satisfaction for having been able to facilitate a better solution and sorrow for the pain that still persisted, that I learned the deepest lesson of my entire career. Justice is imperfect because we try to apply it in an imperfect world. Laws seek order and clarity, but behind them there are lives that fracture and rebuild in silence, carrying the scars of decisions that sometimes seem to have no right answer. When I received that teenager's letter years later, I felt that his pain became an echo of all those stories that never make the news but repeat in the corners of society, in houses where laughter seems to have faded, and in looks that search without finding comfort. His words confronted me with the most uncomfortable truth, that justice does not always heal, that sometimes all we can do is live with the consequences of what we decide from a place where we cannot know all the secrets or the depths of every soul. That letter taught me to listen not only with my ears, but with an open heart. It reminded me that behind every file there is an entire world, with joys, wounds, silences, and hopes. And that my responsibility as a judge does not end with the sentence. It begins right there, at the delicate crossroads between law and real life. Now, when I close my eyes and remember that case, I do not do so with the cold distance of one who issued the ruling, but with the sincere closeness of one who knows that sometimes the greatest value in justice lies in recognizing the wounds that never finish healing. I still hear that distant whisper, a mix of fear and hope, reminding me that the true sentence, the hardest one, is learning to live with the lives we change and with the echo of every word we once spoke, without knowing how deep its impact would be. And if there is one thing I am sure of, it is that there is no manual for these situations, only the will to keep trying to be fair, humane, and responsible in a world where every decision is a fragile bridge connecting the present with an uncertain future. That is, for me, the most authentic and at the same time most unsettling truth a judge can carry, that the scales of justice will never be truly balanced because they also weigh the soul of the one who holds them. The months that followed that new phase of the case were marked by a tension that seemed suspended in the air. It was as if we were all trapped in a delicate dance, where every step had to be measured with utmost care because a single misstep could trigger incalculable consequences. Reality became increasingly complex, and despite the uncle's attempts to find common ground, their differences remained a barrier difficult to overcome. It was not just a matter of fulfilling legal formalities or adjusting a visitation schedule, but of repairing, as much as possible, the broken ties between them and, above all, protecting something much more delicate: the emotional well-being of two children who, without having chosen it, lived amid a conflict that exceeded their limits. I remember one particular day, during one of those moments when everything seemed calm, I received a report from the psychologist in charge of the case that struck me with unexpected force. The document detailed how the younger child, despite efforts, had begun to show signs of rejection toward both uncles, as if he had engraved in his memory the invisible fracture that even the adults could not heal. I was struck by the description of his long silences and evasive glances, which seemed to hint at a hidden fear, something that words could not express. At that moment, I once again felt the overwhelming weight of that initial ruling, how a decision that theoretically should have ended the suffering had actually transformed it into an open, latent wound. But the story took an even more unexpected turn on a cold autumn afternoon when I received a phone call that changed the course of everything. It was the defense attorney of the custodial uncle, with a voice full of urgency and some desperation. He informed me that, following a new medical evaluation, A health problem had been detected in him that could seriously compromise his ability to continue with custody responsibilities. It was not just a physical diagnosis, it involved a series of treatments and care that would prevent, at least for an indefinite time, him from fulfilling the demands that role required. That news fell like a silent bomb within the case, because it opened the possibility that the children, once more, would end up in a situation of uncertainty. At that moment, I had to face an even more painful dilemma. The custody decision could not wait, but any change again meant confronting the families with a process that had already left deep scars. Many nights I spent reviewing files, consulting with experts, and open sessions to hear the parties with the intention of finding the best possible solution. The uncles, barely, agreed on a provisional arrangement, but the feeling of fragility and tension grew with every meeting. I found myself crossing an invisible line between justice as a rule and justice as an attitude, because I understood that in these decisions time worked both for and against it. Every day that passed could solidify a new reality or shatter it into pieces. What struck me most, however, was when I finally had the opportunity to speak directly with the children. It was not a simple or planned meeting. It was a brief session in which I tried to remove the formality that usually surrounds my interventions. I wanted to hear their voices, their silences, their looks seeking answers. The older one, with a maturity beyond his years, confessed with restrained tears that he was afraid of losing everything again, that every change in home, routine, and affections was an internal battle that exhausted him. His sister, shy and reserved, nodded silently, as if confirming a shared pain that found no words. It was a moment full of raw truth that shook me because it made me aware, in a harsh and direct way, of the price that ruling had cost them. I realized that, in that courtroom, it was not just about applying the law but listening to the marks left on the bodies and souls of those who must live it. Meanwhile, the relationship between the uncles grew increasingly tense. Despite steps toward shared agreement, arguments and reproaches arose at every meeting. Sometimes, sitting behind my desk, I could perceive the frustration emanating from them, a weariness that seemed to conceal old wounds that the case had brought to the surface. In one of those hearings, one of them unexpectedly raised his voice, blaming me for issuing a ruling that, according to him, destroyed his nephews. It was a moment of deep personal pain because, although I knew many saw the judge as a distant and inflexible figure, for me it was impossible to separate my humanity from every story. That accusation haunted me in the solitude of my nights, yet it reminded me that justice is neither a heroic act nor a definitive truth, but a task of enormous responsibility, full of contradictions and moral demands that hit hard. As time passed, another unexpected turn added complexity to the plot. The non-custodial uncle, the one who had lost the initial battle, began presenting evidence of his own effort and commitment to contribute to caring for his nephews. He wanted to reinforce the idea of shared custody, but in his own way, with proposals for psychological care, academic support, and activities that could facilitate gradual reintegration into the children's lives. For many, this might have seemed a late attempt to regain ground, but I perceived behind his stance a sincere, albeit surely imperfect, desire to repair what time and decisions had damaged. At that point, the negotiation ceased to be just a legal matter and became a process of collective healing, a mirror where families learned, at the cost of mistakes and pain, that life does not wait for justice's mandate to run its course. One of the most revealing sessions happened when we established, under my supervision, a family mediation service with specialists in childhood trauma. There, despite initial fear and resistance, unexpected moments of dialogue appeared. I heard those uncles share their fears, acknowledge their mistakes, and above all show a genuine intention to change for the children. It was a space where the law blended with hope, and where I, as a judge, could observe how justice can also be a process of growth, although far from linear or perfect. At the end of those sessions, they returned to court with a different attitude, aware that custody would not just be an imposed order, but a shared responsibility requiring daily effort and genuine commitment. Although this evolution filled me with hope, I could not avoid the uncertainty accompanying me. I knew the coming days would not be easy, that at any moment a new crisis could shatter all that had been achieved. The pressure was palpable, and I felt that, in those weeks, I myself somehow became part of that broken family because the empathy and closeness I had built forced me to be more than a judicial figure. I was a silent witness to the human effort to overcome adversity. I understood that beyond laws and rulings, what this case taught me was not to lose faith in transformation when it is sustained by patience, love, and sincere will. One thing that deeply impacted me was how, amid that process, the children began expressing their own desires and longings with a clarity that left me speechless. In one of the follow-up hearings, the older child spoke for the first time with a firm and determined voice. He did not ask to change custody or for the uncles to confront each other more. He only expressed a very simple wish: I just want them to really listen to us and let us feel that we are at home, no matter who we are with. It was a moment of revelation because those apparently simple words carried with them the complexity of their experiences and the fundamental need many adults often forget: to be heard, understood, and above all loved unconditionally. And that phrase remained engraved in my mind as a constant reminder that the center of family law is those vulnerable voices, often silenced by the system's formality. Therefore, driven by that truth, I decided that my role had to transform even further, moving from the rigid imposition of the law to an attitude of constant accompaniment, where justice is present not only in rulings, but in careful follow-up, in seeking resources for the family, and in creating spaces for real dialogue. It was not easy because it meant challenging my own limits and also the very structure of the judicial system, accustomed to resolving things quickly and surely. But I knew that if I did not do it, the human cost would be too high, and that my role should not only be that of a judge, but of a guardian of the delicate balance of those lives who had placed in me a trust as profound as it was unexpected. While that internal transformation occurred, the case continued, leaving lessons that seemed endless. I learned that justice cannot and should not be a solitary act. It needs the collaboration of all involved parties to approach its true meaning. I also discovered that sometimes the real value of a ruling is not in the decision itself, but in the path it opens toward reconstruction, even when that path is traveled amid doubts, mistakes, and tears. And above all, I understood that behind every file there are people whose rescue goes beyond the legal. It is a task of humanity, which we must carry out with humility and commitment, knowing that in this pursuit we will surely fail. But we can never stop trying. The story of those children and their families continued evolving long after the case left my desk. What was a judicial process became for me an experience that transformed my way of understanding justice and myself. Every shy smile, every small achievement, every step forward reminded me that, although the hardest ruling seemed to be the first one, the real challenge did not begin with the judgment, but with the capacity to bear the human consequences emerging from it. And in the end, that was the most valuable lesson justice gave me, that there are no decisive legal acts without emotions, without life, without stories that make everything infinitely more complex and real. I will always carry that bittersweet feeling, a mix of triumph and burden, because I understand that being a judge is not just issuing a ruling, but embracing the uncertainties that decision generates in those who depend on it. Sometimes being fair means being strong, but also being vulnerable. It means carrying a constant memory in the soul that the law is important, but people, with their fragility and resilience, are what truly sustain justice. And that paradox is, for me, the endless core of my work and the reason why, now more than ever, I want to listen attentively, accompany with respect, and decide with humility every time someone entrusts me with a life to protect. Because ultimately, there is no ruling more difficult than one pronounced with an open heart, knowing that although justice tries to be delivered with rigor and objectivity, we can only approach the truth when we accept its limits and embrace the infinite complexity that dwells in every human story we encounter. And that learning, as sweet as it is bitter, has made me grow not only as a judge but as a person, reminding me that the true ruling, the hardest and most important one, is to remain capable of looking and feeling, of understanding that behind every judgment there are lives depending on our voice, and that the impact of our words may resonate forever, far beyond the courtroom, far beyond the case, far beyond ourselves. The days kept passing, and the feeling that the case was advancing on an increasingly thin edge became more present. The sessions, meetings, and reports filled the calendar, but deep down I knew it was not just a matter of documents or legal strategies. There was something at stake that went beyond formality, something that slipped into every glance, every silent gesture of those children who, unwillingly, had become the center of an emotional storm that seemed endless. Uncertainty never left me. On the contrary, it grew tenser, more overwhelming, like a shadow slowly expanding, knowing that at any moment it could darken everything. I clearly remember a meeting in the courtroom where everything seemed on the verge of collapse. The uncles arrived without greeting each other, the tension so palpable that it felt as if the air itself had become heavy and suffocating. The argument started over a small detail, a difference that under normal circumstances would have gone unnoticed, but here exploded like a spark in a powder keg. They accused each other, throwing reproaches that belonged more to old wounds than to the present, and each word carried the weight of years of poorly healed resentments. It was one of those moments when I realized that despite the legal framework supporting the case, the real battle was fought on a much more emotional and difficult-to-measure ground. In the midst of that chaos, I felt the need to intervene in a different way. I set aside the rigid protocol and opted for a more human, closer tone. I asked them to put aside accusations for a moment and try to talk, really talk, about what they felt and dreamed for those children. Reluctantly, they agreed, as if that were an act of courage and also vulnerability. And it was then, in that brief truce, that hidden truths began to emerge. The fear of losing the bond, the guilt that gnawed at them, the timid hope that some still held. Listening to them not only helped me better understand their motivations, but also confirmed that the law alone could not heal those wounds. While those conversations made their way forward, the children remained there, in the middle of that complicated web, with their emotions on edge. In the psychological evaluations, their anguish became more evident. The youngest, especially, showed increasing withdrawal, as if the sum of all the conflicts and changes had imposed on him a shell that barely revealed what he really felt. My heart as a judge tightened every time I read about his prolonged silences, about how he isolated himself to protect from a world that seemed too big and threatening. Those details made me question again and again whether the solution I had initially ordered truly served their well-being or was merely a superficial attempt to find an answer that the law demanded. The medical diagnosis of the custodial uncle added a new dimension to an already complex scenario. When his lawyer informed me of the seriousness of the issue, I felt the case turn into a puzzle impossible to solve. Action was needed quickly, but any change could destroy the fragile stability achieved after months of uncertainty. I imagined sleepless nights, wondering what was the best way to protect those children, to preserve for them a safe and balanced space, even though the pieces were about to fall. It was then when I became most aware of how much justice, in cases like this, must walk hand in hand with humility and patience. In the following weeks, we established a provisional arrangement, which, although agreed upon with reservations by both sides, brought a certain temporary relief. However, that calm was just the surface of a deep and turbulent sea. Doubts grew, along with the fear that any unexpected move could trigger a new crisis. Needless to say, my commitment to that case went beyond issuing decisions. It involved staying alert to every sign, every subtle warning that could prevent a collapse. That constant vigilance was exhausting but essential. Sometimes I felt like a tightrope walker trying to hold in my hands lives hanging by a thread. One of the moments that marked me the most was when I had the chance to see the children outside any protocol, in a brief meeting away from courtroom formality. I wanted to approach them as just another person, without the weight of my title, trying to listen and understand from the heart. The eldest, with heartbreaking maturity, spoke to me about the deep fear of losing everything, about a feeling of insecurity that overwhelmed him. His sister, almost mute, conveyed the same emotional burden in her silence, a pain that needed no words to be understood. Those moments were like a mirror where I could see the true magnitude of what was at stake, beyond legal arguments, beyond adult disputes. It was a painful reminder that behind every case file are human beings with wounded souls, and that justice must be more than a cold judgment. It must be an act of sensitivity and care. As the months passed, the relationship between the uncles fluctuated between attempts at rapprochement and outbursts of conflict. It was clear that although both wanted what was best for the children, accumulated resentments limited them, creating a tense atmosphere at every meeting. In one of those hearings, one of them could not contain his frustration and launched a harsh accusation at me, blaming me for the harm he attributed to the ruling. I felt that blow as if it pierced me, because I knew that behind that complaint there was much more than criticism. It was the raw pain of a torn family, of adults who also suffered, and of a judicial reality that sometimes seems to leave no room for emotional repair. At that moment, I understood that being a judge does not mean being exempt from humanity. Rather, it weighs heavily with every decision and every consequence. The scenario took a new turn when the non-custodial uncle showed not only willingness, but also concrete actions to get involved in the children's upbringing. He presented proposals that included psychological care for the children, support at school, activities that could facilitate a progressive and healthy relationship. There were those who interpreted this as a late move or a strategy to gain ground in custody, but I recognized the authenticity of that gesture. I understood that despite his mistakes and limitations, he wanted to heal, build bridges, and take on an active role. That acknowledgement was a turning point, an opportunity to stop seeing the case as a contest and start understanding it as a process of long-term reconstruction, albeit full of obstacles and setbacks. It was in that context that we decided to implement family mediation with experts in child trauma, a space carefully designed so everyone could express themselves without fear and start to heal. The first sessions were tense, with much resistance from the adults, who seemed afraid to open wounds they weren't sure could be closed. However, little by little, the barriers began to fall, and moments of unexpected honesty appeared. I heard confessions of fear, guilt, fatigue, but also of a genuine desire to find a better path. It was a space where law mixed with hope and where, as a judge, I was allowed to see that justice can also be an invitation to grow and change, even though the journey is hard and full of uncertainties. Despite those small advances, uncertainty remained a constant companion. I knew that the balance achieved could collapse at any moment, that any crisis could drag down everything that had been so hard to build. I felt that, in a way, I had become part of that story, a silent witness sharing both the weight and the hope. Empathy with the family was a bridge that connected me to them beyond the role of judge, and that closeness made every decision lived with even more intensity and responsibility. I realized that justice is not measured only in rulings, but in the ability to accompany, to support when everything seems to falter. Something that deeply moved me was the moment when the children, particularly the eldest, raised their voice with surprising clarity to express their own wishes. He did not ask for radical changes or more disputes. The only thing he requested was to be truly heard and to feel that they had a home, no matter where it was. Those words, simple but powerful, became for me a beacon, a reminder that the center of family justice must always be those who need it most, the children. Their voices, often overshadowed by formality and haste, are the heartbeat we must never lose sight of, the pulse that gives meaning to every decision we make. Driven by that truth, I decided to go beyond the ruling. I understood that my role also had to be one of accompaniment, that justice must manifest not only in the verdict, but in follow-up, in seeking resources, in facilitating spaces where dialogue could remain alive. It was a huge challenge because the system is not designed for that type of continuous and humane intervention. It demands speed, certainties, final resolutions. But I knew that giving up that path meant condemning these families to a perpetual cycle of conflict and open wounds. Thus, my role ceased to be only to administer justice and became also to care and protect, even if that meant opening myself to my own vulnerabilities and limits. Time passed, and with it, new lessons arrived. I understood that justice is not an island, but a network that needs the cooperation of many to approach a true meaning. I realized that beyond a ruling, the most valuable thing is the path that decision opens, even if full of doubts and stumbles. And above all, I learned that behind every case file there are people whose rescue transcends the legal, that justice is a human task requiring humility and commitment, aware that it is never perfect and that its greatest virtue lies in the attempt. Although the case left my desk and the hearings ended, the story remained alive in my memory and in my way of conceiving justice. Every small progress, every regained smile, every step forward was to me proof that the true ruling was not the one initially issued firmly, but the capacity to sustain and accompany that complex process that followed. I learned that being a judge is not only deciding, but also embracing the uncertainties those decisions bring. That justice requires strength, yes, but also vulnerability, that it is a task carrying the weight of an open heart, willing to listen, understand, and be moved. That experience left an indelible mark on me, a mixture of triumph and burden that I still carry. Because I understood that the law is fundamental, but what truly supports justice are the people, with all their fragility and their capacity to endure and to change. And that paradox, that delicate and eternal balance, is the very core of my work, the reason why, now more than ever, I want to keep listening attentively and accompanying with respect those who entrust me with their stories and lives, knowing well that it will never be an easy task, nor free of pain, but indispensable and profoundly human. The case seemed to be gradually finding a calmer course, but the peace soon shattered, like a thin layer of ice cracking under the unexpected weight of new tensions. One morning, a notification arrived at my office that put me on alert. A new social report indicated an incident involving the minor in a school setting, an episode that, although seemingly small, triggered all the alarms I already carried inside. The news reminded me that nothing was assured and that what had been achieved so far could crumble in an instant. It was not just a school problem, it was a reflection of all the fragility that still lay beneath the surface, and it made me think that every progress, no matter how minimal it seemed, was wrapped in a complex web of vulnerabilities. I contacted the support team, calling for an urgent meeting to assess the situation from every possible perspective. In those meetings, I once again heard the voices of the pediatrician, the psychologist, the social workers, all deeply concerned about the emotional and physical well-being of the children. It was not easy to convey urgency without sowing paralyzing fear, but I understood that swift and decisive action was necessary. The minor's fragility manifested not only in behaviors, but also in low self-esteem and the expression of a latent feeling of abandonment and helplessness. The following days were a back and forth of reports, interviews, and meetings that left me exhausted, but I never doubted the goal: to protect that voice, to ensure it would not be lost amid adult controversies. Meanwhile, the relationship between the uncles was at a critical point. The custodial uncle, despite his diagnosis and the limitations it entailed, began showing signs of desperation. He felt cornered, abandoned, and somehow made invisible in the process. In one of those hearings, the tension overflowed into a reproach filled with pain and contained rage. He openly questioned not only the decisions made, but also me as a judge, wondering whether we were truly looking out for the children's best interests or simply paying the price for old family grudges with someone else's suffering. Those words struck me deeply. It was not a legal criticism, but a desperate cry calling to be heard, for recognition. At that moment, I realized that the wounds were not only within the family, but also in the system they had turned to, which sometimes seemed blind to the complexity of human pain. I then decided to take a step that initially made me hesitate, but that deep down I knew was necessary. I proposed a joint and open review of the case with the active participation of all involved, guided by new specialized mediators who could, beyond the law, help build real bridges. For many, it was a surprise, for others, an opportunity, and for some, even a risk. Nevertheless, that was the idea: to step outside rigid frameworks, to listen without judging, to try to understand beyond the file and the signed papers. What followed was a slow, sometimes painful process where the truth surfaced with all its rawness. Hidden fears, accumulated resentments, moments of abandonment, and also love, awkward and disorderly, but love nonetheless, were spoken of. Attending those sessions showed me their most human sides and, at the same time, made me question the limits of formal justice in the face of the urgent need for emotional reconstruction. An unexpected turn came shortly after when I received a letter written by the oldest of the children. It was not because he sought something formal or legal, but because, in his own way, he wanted me to know what he felt, what he needed, and his own story, from the innocence and depth only children can have. He wrote that he wished for peace, not only for himself but for the whole family, that he wanted to leave behind the days when he felt like an object caught in the middle of a dispute, and that he longed for the adults to learn to understand that beyond their fights, he and his sister deserved stability, love, and a safe place. It was a simple document, full of spelling errors and short sentences, but it shook me and made me reflect on the responsibility I had not only as a judge, but as a human being with the capacity and the duty to do more than just apply the law. That message gave new momentum to my commitment, and with it, the decision arose to convene an extraordinary meeting with all the professionals involved in the case. At that table, where technically only lawyers and experts should be present, therapists, social workers, and teachers were now added. I wanted to create a space where not only legal actions could be coordinated, but also the necessary interventions so the children could find a life project beyond the conflicts. In that meeting, every word, every proposal had a different echo because we were talking about lives, about the future, about real opportunities. It was a moment of deep satisfaction to see how, little by little, alliances began to form that until then had seemed impossible. However, the transition was neither linear nor easy. As new strategies were implemented, unexpected rejections appeared, especially from the custodial uncle, who was caught between his health limitations and a growing sense of loss. He felt displaced, fearing that his role as protector was disappearing. That anguish translated into episodes of isolation and, at times, behaviors that complicated coexistence. During a judicial review, his lawyer revealed that the situation was delicate and that any hasty decision could trigger a harmful domino effect for the children. It was a tense moment where the balance I had so often tried to maintain seemed to break. Facing that scenario made me feel more vulnerable and aware of the fragility of the process. Amid all this, the non-custodial uncle, driven by a genuine desire to get closer and rebuild bridges, began to make small gestures that seemed insignificant but meant a great deal to the children. Attending school meetings, participating in joint therapies, accompanying recreational activities, all this began to create a different environment where the children could feel that there were other ways to feel love, protection, and belonging. It was as if these actions slowed down, even if only slightly, the wear caused by years of unresolved conflicts. The transformation was neither perfect nor quick, but the mere fact that it happened was already a valuable step. And I, from my position, learned to appreciate those details as much as the legal rulings. Over time, a new narrative was woven, one where the protagonists, both adults and children, began to reconfigure their story from a healthier place. But the shadow of the past remained present, and at times I wondered how much of that change was real and how much a fragile illusion. In one of those setbacks, the school alerted me about an emotional crisis the minor suffered, an anxiety episode that required immediate attention. It was a brutal reminder that wounds do not disappear with a simple effort, but need consistency and containment. That night, as I reviewed the medical reports, I felt my chest tighten. Justice, I thought, must be a living process, not a final sentence, because life itself is a continuum where vulnerability and strength intertwine. My visits outside the courtroom became more frequent. It was not part of my duties, I knew, but something inside me pushed me to be close, to observe, to accompany. In one of those encounters with the children, the oldest confessed that he had stopped dreaming of perfect futures because he had learned that life was actually a path filled with stumbles and repairs. He told me about his hopes, his fears, and also a deep desire to simply be a child, without the burden of adults' disputes. That conversation opened my eyes even more. It reminded me that behind every case are beings who need not only justice but compassion, understanding, and time to heal. Aware of this, I promoted the creation of a comprehensive follow-up program for cases with high emotional complexity, including psychological supervision, school support, and flexible legal accompaniment. It was an innovative idea for the court and, of course, for me, representing a significant change from the traditional way of acting. Moving from an almost mechanical justice to a compassionate and accompanied justice was an institutional and personal challenge. But I felt it was the only way to honor the suffering and struggle of those families because deciding cannot be the whole story. Care, follow-up, and flexibility are essential parts of true judicial action. In the past year, I cannot deny that there were advances but also setbacks. Confrontations did not disappear entirely, nor did the tears or the uncertainty. But there were moments when the children's shy smiles let me know that, despite everything, hope persisted. I remember an afternoon during a group activity when the oldest took my hand and, with a sincere smile, said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I don't know if it was a big word or simply a reflection of the trust he was gradually building. For me, that moment was a small victory and the reason why moving forward became indispensable. Now, looking back, I realize this case changed not only the lives of those families, but also mine as a judge and as a person. It taught me that laws are necessary, but insufficient if not accompanied by humanity, patience, and active listening. That behind every ruling there is a world of emotions, intertwined stories, and dreams that deserve to be respected and protected. That being a judge ultimately means embracing uncertainty, being willing to make mistakes and learn, to vacillate between firmness and sensitivity. And that in that tension lies the true work, the most difficult, but also the most valuable. Even now, when the files have been archived and the testimonies no longer fill the hallways, I feel the shadow of that ruling I once issued, and that was really just the beginning. That shadow accompanies me and reminds me that justice does not end with a signature or a seal. Justice is an endless path, a constant search that confronts us with our own humanity and the enormous responsibility of caring for the fragile, of supporting the vulnerable. Sometimes I wonder if we will ever truly be ready for that burden. But I know that, no matter how difficult, it is a task worth every second because in that act, as complex as it is necessary, lies the possibility of transforming lives, of opening spaces where pain can turn into hope, where the past does not forever mark the future. Thus, this story continues, not only in my memories, but in the way I perform my role every day, with an open heart, willing to listen and accompany, aware that there is no perfect ruling, only justice in motion, human and imperfect, that can only aspire to be just when it recognizes its limits and fearlessly commits itself to the infinite task of caring and protecting. The process, although slowly, seemed to settle. Still held that latent tension that reminded me that nothing is static when the heart and the law intertwine. The days followed one another in an almost ritual pattern, marked by encounters that demanded more than just judicial objectivity. Some of those moments surprised me, like when in a session one of the specialists shared an unexpected observation that illuminated an aspect of the minor that had previously gone unnoticed, an extreme sensitivity to criticism, a persistent fear of disappointing. That revelation not only made me rethink the strategy, but opened a window for everyone involved to learn how to modulate how they spoke and acted in front of him, understanding that every word could be either a brick to build or a stone to tear down. However, the balance was fragile and, at times, broke abruptly. I remember an especially difficult day when, during a joint interview, the minor, from his usual shyness, burst into tears. It was an outburst that echoed in the silence of the room, a silent scream of accumulated anguish that could not be ignored. The adults present, including myself, were faced with an uncomfortable truth. We had made progress, yes, but there was still an emotional chasm to cross, an open wound that bled with every attempt at reconciliation. It was that moment of vulnerability that revealed to me more clearly that justice not only had to be obeyed, but also carefully shaped to respond to the human, the changed, the still under construction. Meanwhile, the relationship between the uncles fluctuated between steps forward and setbacks difficult to foresee. The custodial uncle, who was already showing signs of physical deterioration, seemed to have stopped in a kind of desperate isolation. It was not only his health that suffered, but the weight of feeling displaced, unnecessary. At one point, during a tense meeting, I saw how that man, who once was a pillar, collapsed. Not knowing what to do, for the first time I found myself questioning my own certainties and the rigidity of my decisions. I felt the bottomless complexity of the role played by the people behind the files and understood that legal tools had to coexist with compassion to avoid sinking in a sea of unease. But, curiously, just when everything seemed to oscillate between progress and fall, the other uncle appeared, the one who did not have custody but did have the will to rebuild. His small gestures, once undervalued, began to transform the atmosphere. Attendance at therapy, participation in school activities, brief but genuine moments with the children gradually opened new emotional paths. It was as if, amid the noise and adversity, a thread of hope was silently but firmly woven. I understood that emotional reconstruction is a journey that admits no leaps, nourished by the perseverance of those small gestures that sometimes go unnoticed by the world but not by those who need them most. As time went by, I began to observe that those gestures, those small signs of affection, had a tangible effect on the children. The expression on their faces, the way they opened up in moments of trust, even the way they began to tell their own story with less pain and more nuance, made me realize that, although far from perfect, we were traveling a new path. One where people recovered some space to be more than victims or protagonists of disputes. It became clear to me again that the justice I sought had to look beyond the ruling. It had to take care and accompany, because only thus, in that slowness, could genuine change be achieved. However, new challenges also came that put all these advances to the test. The school sent another alert. This time, the minor had suffered a severe anxiety episode requiring urgent medical attention. It was a crushing blow, a slap to the illusion that simply with rules and commitments everything would change. That crisis hit me personally, deeply. While reviewing the reports and talking with the specialists, I understood that the scars were deep and that the path to healing would be long. It reminded me that protection was not enough. Accompaniment had to be offered at every step, firm and constant support, never assuming that the danger had passed. That episode caused me to rethink my role, the system's limitations, and the essential need to build strong and humane bridges that could withstand even emotional storms. That critical moment also pushed me to deepen my closeness with the children outside the strict legal framework. I knew I had no formal obligation to do so, but something inside me acknowledged that presence was vital. I still remember that private conversation with the eldest child, when, with a sincerity only a child hardened by life can have, he confessed that he had stopped dreaming of perfect futures. He told me about his stumbles, his fears, and about that deep desire we sometimes all forget, simply to be a child. He spoke of a basic longing, unadorned, to feel that he could exist without the heavy burden of adult disputes that seemed to decide every minute of his life. It was an encounter that struck me more than any legal argument because it reminded me that behind every judgment there were lives full of fear and hope, and that my work had to be more than a ruling, it had to be a human commitment. Motivated by that conversation, I decided to promote a comprehensive follow-up program for cases like this one, especially those with high emotional complexity. I sought to take a bold step, to transform justice into a living process that recognized the need for psychological support, school assistance, and a flexible legal follow-up that not only dictated decisions, but ensured a coherent and compassionate path. It was an institutional challenge, a cultural change within the court, but also a personal affirmation. I knew then that justice could no longer continue as a cold and distant machine. It had to humanize itself, learn to listen and adapt, because only then could it truly defend the most fragile with effectiveness. During that last year, progress was a slow process, sprinkled with tiny victories and painful setbacks. Confrontations did not disappear, nor did tears or uncertainty, but the shy smiles that occasionally broke out on the children confirmed that hope remained alive. I will never forget that day when, participating in a group activity, the eldest child took my hand with fresh trust and told me, with a simplicity that moved me to my core, "Thank you for not giving up on us." It was a small phrase, yes, but for me it meant a huge triumph, a sign that the path was worth it, that the struggle to be human in justice made sense. Looking back now, closing this part of the process, I feel this case transformed me completely. It taught me that laws, despite their importance, are insufficient when not accompanied by humanity, patience, and the courage to question and learn. It revealed to me that true justice is not one imposed with a firm hand, but one that opens itself to uncertainty, daring to waver between necessary firmness and indispensable sensitivity. I understood that being a judge also means embracing error, recognizing limits, and surrendering without fear to the complex and eternal task of caring for the vulnerable. This case was more than a sentence. It was a constant reminder that justice is an endless journey, always holding more questions than answers. And although the files now rest in the archives and the hallways have gone silent, I feel that sentence was not an end, but a beginning. I carry a weight that does not lighten with time, the awareness that justice does not conclude with a signature or a seal, but is an infinite pursuit that confronts us with our own humanity and the profound responsibility to support and protect what is fragile. I wonder if we will ever truly be prepared to bear that weight, but I know for sure that, however difficult it may be, it is a labor worth every moment. Because in that act, as complex as it is necessary, lies the real possibility of transforming lives, of opening spaces where pain can give way to hope, and where the past can challenge its destiny to build a different future. Thus, as I close this chapter, I understand that my role now goes beyond issuing sentences. It is to be a vigilant guardian of the stories entrusted to me, a patient companion in the endless quest for justice measured not only by rules, but by life itself. And that, perhaps, is the most difficult and at the same time the most valuable sentence a judge can pronounce.